like obviously when you're working with something in the manufacturing industry, it's very tightly tied to the economy and also economic growth. So how do you kind of take this balance? Because I can imagine that maybe some sort of technology or some sort of decarbonization method is maybe not the cheapest, or maybe it's limiting in how many units you can produce compared to traditional methods. I can imagine that there's this discussion, right, between, economic productivity versus maybe more so environmental justice, in which we're trying to decarbonize towards environmental justice. So kind of like, how would you say you and your work or your think tank essentially navigates this tension between its research in terms of economic growth and as well as policy recommendations? And how do you balance these two factors when you're working industrial decarbonization?
That's a really interesting point. I think I might separate this into two and first talk about like the cost of everything and how that cost is spread out, like who bears that cost. I think that is a key ethical question actually, because you mentioned and it's true, like these new or lower carbon technologies are typically more expensive and
Mhm.
don't have the scale to produce the same amount of material yet. And then the second part is a little bit of like in this transition where we have to change everything, basically, like the way we manufacture these materials, even. Are we changing everything and doing additional good for society, or are we changing everything and like keeping the environmental injustices in place, of which there are many? Um, so back to the first part, I think that there is where I see the cost question coming into play the most is like the international sphere, like the international discussions on like whose fault is climate change, who should pay for it, and like if we're thinking about economic development, all of these like low development level or emerging economies that still need to like build out the road infrastructure, that's cement and concrete, right? Build out the road infrastructure, build out like their power plants to like start increasing their like citizens' livelihoods, like their, um, just their economy. Like I think that is a tricky question. But what if you turn it on its head, there's also a lot of economic value that can be created from these low carbon technologies. Because I think there's a general understanding, like by governments in the world, Paris Agreement, for example, that we need to like reduce carbon emissions and mitigate climate change. Otherwise, like we will pay the cost like many times over, right? It's like the cost of like wildfire like
Natural
um
disasters. Yeah.
fighting natural disasters, like infrastructure damage, like health and disease, all of these things. Like that's actually the cost ceiling that we're all looking at that we all face. So when we look at that cost ceiling, it's like the low carbon technologies are actually cheaper, but they're just not as cheap as status quo right now. So that's still a gap. So then it goes to like, okay, well, we can still make money out of it because, you know, governments will want to like decarbonize. There will be some like public money that goes into like supporting these technologies. Therefore, individuals can benefit, can get those grants, can like scale up, can create companies and IP and sell these technologies around the world and, make a profit.